The moving truck groaned as it navigated the winding, immaculate streets of Willow Creek Preserve, finally pulling up to the curb before a handsome brick colonial judge, Catherine Sterling, stepped out of her own car, stretching after the long drive from the city bustle she was so eager to leave behind. At 52, recently appointed to the district court bench, she craved sanctuary, a peaceful community where the relentless demands of her profession could fade into the background each evening. Willow Creek, with its ancient oaks, canopying manicured lawns, and the promise of quiet evenings, seemed the perfect place for this new beginning. This was her search for tranquility realized. As the movers began unloading boxes, a petite woman with meticulously styled silver hair and dressed in a crisp linen suit approached Catherine, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Welcome to Willow Creek Preserve, Judge Sterling," she said, her smile practiced and precise. "I'm Evelyn Hayes, president of our Homeowners Association. We're simply delighted to have you." Evelyn presented Catherine with a binder thick enough to rival a legal case file, just a few community guidelines. She explained, her tone light, but leaving no room for interpretation. "The CCNRs help us maintain harmony and preserve the unique character of our neighborhood. I'm sure you'll find understanding HOA regulations quite straightforward." Catherine accepted the binder, the weight surprisingly substantial. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. I look forward to settling in and finding my quiet life here." Evelyn's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Harmony requires participation. Judge adherence is key. Just then, Catherine noticed her new next-door neighbor gesture, subtly towards her recycling bin, placed a foot outside the designated painted square on the curb. The neighbor offered a tight-lipped smile and mouthed, "Only inside the lines, dear." A tiny ripple disturbed the surface of Catherine's anticipated peace. Evelyn Hayes gave a knowing, almost imperceptible nod before turning away. Perhaps achieving tranquility here involved more than just unpacking boxes. The first few months in Willow Creek Preserve unfolded with the quiet rhythm Catherine had desperately sought. The demanding cases at the courthouse seemed miles away as she established routines. Morning coffee on the back patio, overlooking the woods, evening walks under the canopy of oaks. She diligently followed the community rules, ensuring her trash bins were perfectly placed and her lawn maintained to the exacting standards seemingly shared by all her neighbors. The initial search for tranquility felt successful. The peaceful community was living up to its promise, offering a much-needed respite from her high-pressure career. Then, tucked under her windshield wiper, one crisp autumn morning, was a stark white envelope bearing the Willow Creek Preserve HOA insignia. Inside, a formal notice informed her that parking her vehicle, her perfectly respectable late-model sedan, in the driveway overnight was a violation of community guidelines. It cited a clause regarding the need to maintain aesthetic uniformity and ensure driveways remain clear when vehicles are not in active use. A parking violation notice felt absurd. Active use wasn't simply being parked there. A form of passive necessary use, confused, but assuming a simple misunderstanding. Catherine retrieved the heavy binder Evelyn Hayes had given her. She located the referenced section under Community Appearance Standards. The language was indeed vague, open to broad interpretation. Surely a reasonable explanation would clear this up. She drafted a polite email to the general HOA contact address, explaining that her garage was currently occupied by unpacked boxes and stored items from her previous residence, a temporary situation she was working to resolve. The reply, received 2 days later, was courteous but unhelpful. It restated the rule, thanked her for her understanding, and suggested any further clarification or requests for variance needed to be formally submitted in writing for board review or discussed directly with the HOA president, Mrs. Evelyn Hayes. The email felt like hitting a polite, impenetrable wall. The HOA rules, it seemed, were less about reason and more about rigid adherence enforced by a system designed to deflect rather than discuss. The first genuine crack had appeared in the facade of Willow Creek's perfect harmony. The Willow Creek Preserve Community Center, multi-purpose room, lived up to its name with a sterile lack of charm. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat glare on rows of uncomfortable metal folding chairs facing a long table. Behind it sat Evelyn Hayes, flanked by 2 other board members, whose expressions mirrored her own blend of polite impassivity. A handful of residents dotted the chairs, their postures suggesting resigned attendance rather than active participation. Catherine took a seat near the back, the HOA meeting atmosphere, feeling less like a community gathering and more like a formal, slightly chilly deposition. When the agenda reached resident concerns, Catherine walked to the front, standing beside a small lectern. She calmly introduced herself and addressed the parking notice. As I mentioned in my email, she began keeping her tone measured and reasonable. My garage is temporarily housing boxes and inherited furniture from my move. It's a short-term situation, and I simply need to utilize my driveway for overnight parking until I can properly organize the space, likely within the next few weeks. She focused on the practical necessity, hoping logic would prevail in this community governance setting. Evelyn Hayes leaned towards her microphone, a practiced smile fixed on her face. "Thank you, Judge Sterling," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge of condescension. "While the board certainly appreciates residents taking the time to communicate, the CC&Rs regarding driveway parking are quite clear. They exist to maintain the aesthetic harmony and property values for everyone." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "We simply cannot make exceptions. Rules are rules after all. I trust someone with your background understands the importance of adhering to established regulations." The other board members nodded in silent, unified agreement. Catherine glanced towards the residents. A few nodded along with Evelyn, their faces impassive. Others meticulously avoided her gaze, staring intently at the beige carpeting or the meeting agenda clutched in their hands. Among them, Catherine noticed an older woman with kind eyes, perhaps the same neighbor who'd corrected her bin placement, though she couldn't be sure, who met her gaze for a fleeting second before quickly looking down, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression. It was a subtle but clear signal of the homeowner association, disputes that likely simmered beneath the surface. Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Logic had no purchase here. This wasn't about finding a reasonable accommodation, it was about demonstrating authority. The board presented a united front, and the residents, through either agreement or quiet fear, offered no dissent. The power of the HOA was absolute, and she had just experienced its public assertion. The politeness vanished from the HOA notices that followed the meeting. Within a week, another white envelope appeared, this one stating second notice of violation. A few days later, a third arrived, its tone sharper, mentioning potential fines if the ongoing violation wasn't rectified immediately. The escalating HOA issues were becoming a source of constant low-grade anxiety for Catherine, a stark contrast to the peaceful existence she'd envisioned. Frustrated by the inflexibility and the impersonal nature of the HOA enforcement, she called her longtime friend and trusted colleague David Chen, a sharp attorney based back in the city. "An HOA towing your car for parking in your own driveway? Seriously, Catherine?" David listened patiently, then sighed. "Look, legally, their CC&Rs might be vaguely worded enough to give them cover, especially if you technically agreed to them when you bought the place. Fighting, it could be a long, annoying, and potentially expensive headache. Is it worth the hassle versus just clearing out the garage faster?" He was practical, always urging caution. Sometimes compliance is the path of least resistance, even when it feels ridiculous. Catherine appreciated his pragmatic advice, but something about the principle of the matter chafed. Still, she resolved to expedite the garage clearing that weekend before she could even start. However, another envelope arrived. This one marked "Final Notice" in bold red letters. It stated that failure to remove the vehicle from the driveway during non-daylight hours immediately would result in further action, including potential towing at the owner's expense, as per the established community regulations. Immediately. The word felt overly dramatic. Surely they wouldn't act overnight. She was going to comply, she just needed one more day, Saturday, to tackle the boxes. Exhausted after a long week in court, she pulled into her driveway that Friday evening, locking the car with the firm intention of moving it into a partially cleared garage space first thing in the morning. She underestimated the speed and resolve simmering beneath Willow Creek's placid surface. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Catherine poured her coffee, anticipating a long day of unpacking. Stepping out onto her front porch to retrieve the newspaper, she stopped at the coffee mug halfway to her lips. The driveway was empty, utterly, starkly empty. For a moment, her mind refused to process it. Did I park it somewhere else? Did I already move it? Then the cold dread washed over her. The final notice immediately. Disbelief warred with a rising tide of panic. They hadn't just threatened, they had acted. Her car was gone. The shocking HOA action left her standing frozen on her porch, the quiet morning suddenly feeling ominous and violated. After a series of frustrating phone calls, Catherine finally tracked her sedan to Kowalski's Towing and Recovery, located in an industrial pocket on the outskirts of town. The contrast with Willow Creek's pristine avenues was jarring. The tow yard was a sprawling expanse of gravel and mud, packed tight with vehicles in various states of repair and disrepair, all enclosed by a high chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A large rusting sign bearing the company name creaked in the breeze. The air hung heavy with the smell of oil and exhaust. This wasn't just a place cars were stored. It felt like where vehicles came to await judgment. Inside the cramped, cluttered office, a man in his late 50s, with tired eyes and grease-stained coveralls, looked up from a dog-eared paperback. A nameplate on the counter read, "Gus Kowalski," Catherine explained. Trying to keep the tremor of anger from her voice that her car had been towed from her private driveway in Willow Creek Preserve overnight, Gus barely reacted, tapping a few keys on an ancient computer monitor. "Yep, silver sedan, came in about 3 a.m. Willow Creek HOA authorization." He shrugged his indifference a practiced defense. "Look, lady, it's simple. HOA calls we tow. We just follow the paperwork they give us." He slid a form across the counter. "That'll be $350 for the tow, plus $100 a day. Storage started midnight. $450. Catherine stared at the figure, incredulous. "For parking in my own driveway? This is outrageous." Gus sighed, the sound laced with years of hearing similar complaints. "Tell it to your HOA. My guy's got to get paid. You want the car back? You pay the vehicle, recovery fees." He gestured vaguely towards the yard. "Cash or credit?" Clenching her jaw. Catherine pulled out her credit card. "I am paying this under protest," she stated clearly. Ensuring he heard, she meticulously collected the itemized receipt and copies of the tow authorization paperwork. As Gus handed her the keys, he leaned slightly over the counter, lowering his voice a fraction. "Between you and me," he muttered, glancing towards the door, "that Willow Creek bunch, their frequent flyers here, keep us busy." The comment hung in the air as Catherine walked out to retrieve her car. It wasn't just an inflexible rule. It was a pattern. The HOA disputes in Willow Creek clearly ran deeper than just her driveway. Driving away from Kowalski's grim kingdom, the violation felt sharp and personal. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Back in the quiet solitude of her study, the simmering anger Catherine felt transformed into cold, focused resolve. The frustration of the tow yard, the dismissive bureaucracy, the sheer audacity of the HOA's actions. It all coalesced. This was no longer just an annoying neighborhood dispute. It was an unlawful seizure of private property executed under the flimsy guise of community aesthetics. Judge Catherine Sterling pushed aside the wronged resident. The meticulous legal mind took over. Hours were spent not just rereading the Willow Creek CC&Rs, but delving into state property laws, statutes regarding property rights, protection, trespass, and the specific limitations placed on homeowner associations regarding non-judicial enforcement actions, like towing from private driveways without explicit, unambiguous, and legally sound prior consent or immediate hazard justification. The HOA operated within its own bubble of perceived authority, but that bubble wasn't impervious to actual law. She drafted the letter with painstaking care. It wasn't an emotional plea. It was a formal legal objection and a cease and desist notice. It clearly outlined the events, cited the relevant state statutes the HOA appeared to have violated, contested the legality of towing a legally parked vehicle from private property without due process, and formally demanded the cessation of any further threats or actions regarding her vehicle under these circumstances. It was precise, factual, and carried the unmistakable weight of legal challenges against HOA. One copy was sent via certified mail to the official Willow Creek Preserve HOA board address. For the other, Catherine walked the quiet evening streets to Evelyn Hayes' residence, a home even more immaculately maintained than her own, if possible. She rang the doorbell. Evelyn opened the door, her customary polite hostess smile firmly in place, though it faltered slightly, seeing Catherine standing there holding a plain manila envelope. "Judge Sterling, is there something I can help you with?" "Mrs. Hayes," Catherine said, her voice level and calm, devoid of the anger simmering beneath. "I wanted to ensure you personally received a copy of this formal objection regarding the towing of my vehicle." She extended the envelope. Evelyn took it, her eyes flicking from Catherine's face to the envelope and back again. For a moment, the practiced composure wavered, replaced by genuine surprise, perhaps even a flicker of alarm. She regained control quickly. "Oh, Well, thank you, Judge. As you know, any formal matters, she began, her voice regaining its smooth tone, are typically handled by the association's legal counsel. I will certainly pass this along to them. She clutched the envelope like an unwelcome piece of evidence. I trust they will review it carefully, Catherine replied evenly, holding Evelyn's gaze for a moment longer before turning to leave. The first legal shot had been fired. The polite veneer of Willow Creek had been pierced not by anger, but by the cool, sharp point of the law. The response from the law firm representing the Willow Creek Preserve HOA arrived less than a week later. If Catherine had expected contrition or even a cautious legal parry, she was mistaken. The letter, printed on heavy cream stationery, was aggressively dismissive. It brushed aside her citations of state property law as irrelevant in the face of the binding CC&Rs she had implicitly agreed to upon purchasing her home. It characterized her parked car not as a temporary necessity, but as a persistent eyesore detrimental to community standards. Most chillingly, the letter escalated the threats dramatically. It stated that should she continue to violate the overnight parking rule, the association was fully prepared to exercise its rights under the governing documents, which included imposing significant daily fines, placing a property lien threat against her home to recover those fines, and if necessary, initiating procedures to declare the vehicle abandoned and arrange for its auction to satisfy outstanding penalties. They weren't just defending their actions, they were doubling down, throwing the legal gauntlet with force. The HOA legal action was becoming overtly hostile. Catherine read the letter twice, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. The sheer arrogance, the blatant disregard for basic property rights was stunning. This wasn't about aesthetics anymore. It was a naked power play. She immediately scanned the document and emailed it to David Chen with a simple subject line, "Their response." David called within the hour. His earlier caution was gone, replaced by audible indignation. "Catherine, this is unbelievable. Auction her car. Place a lien for parking in her own driveway. This isn't just aggressive, it's bordering on predatory. They're banking on homeowners being too intimidated or unable to afford a legal fight." He paused, his voice hardening. "Okay, forget being cautious. This is egregious. HOA overreach. They've drawn a line." "They certainly have," Catherine agreed grimly. "We can't let them think they can get away with this." David continued, his legal mind already strategizing. Threatening to auction personal property without a court judgment based on this flimsy premise. We need to shut this down before they try anything else. We need to file for a temporary restraining order immediately. Get an injunction preventing them from towing, fining, or taking any further action regarding your car while we sort this out in court. The path was clear. Diplomacy had failed. Formal objection had been met with threats. The battle for homeowner rights was moving from strongly worded letters to the courtroom. "Agreed, David," Catherine said, the decision bringing a sense of clarity amidst the anger. "Let's prepare the filing." The paperwork for the temporary restraining order was filed swiftly. David Chen handled the submission, listing Judge Catherine Sterling as the plaintiff seeking protection from the Willow Creek Preserve Homeowners Association. The case landed on the docket of Judge Avery Bellwether, a respected senior judge known for his sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach. When Judge Bellwether reviewed the initial filing, the plaintiff's name and title immediately caught his eye. A sitting district court judge seeking a TRO against her own HOA, highly unusual, sensing the potential complexities and the need for prompt judicial review, he expedited the hearing schedule. Days later, Catherine found herself in the familiar setting of a courtroom, but this time seated at the plaintiff's table beside David. Across the aisle sat the HOA's attorney, a slick, confident man in an expensive suit. Behind him, impeccably composed but radiating tension, sat Evelyn Hayes, her gaze fixed straight ahead. The courtroom drama felt surreal from this perspective. David presented their case first, laying out the facts clearly and concisely. The initial warnings, the towing from Catherine's private driveway, the HOA's aggressive legal response threatening liens and auction, the lack of due process. "Your Honor," David argued, "the defendant Willow Creek Preserve HOA has demonstrated a clear pattern of overreach and intimidation. Their threats to seize and sell personal property without judicial oversight constitute a significant risk of irreparable harm. We seek this restraining order to prevent further unlawful actions while the underlying legal issues are properly addressed." The HOA's lawyer countered smoothly, emphasizing the binding nature of the CC&Rs. Your Honor, Judge Sterling willingly agreed to abide by the community's governing documents upon purchasing her property. These rules, including those regarding vehicle parking designed to maintain community aesthetics and property values, are applied uniformly. The association acted within its established authority. This is simply a case of a resident refusing to comply. He framed it as a contractual obligation, downplaying the homeowner rights violation. Judge Bellwether listened intently, his gaze shifting between the attorneys. He then directed pointed questions at the HOA's counsel. Counsel, can you point to the specific statute that grants this HOA the authority to unilaterally seize and auction personal property from a private driveway to satisfy alleged fines outside of a formal judgment? He questioned the interpretation of active use and the proportionality of threatening auction for a parking issue. Are you suggesting the aesthetic displeasure of a parked car warrants bypassing standard legal procedures for property seizure? The lawyer attempted to deflect, circling back to the CC&Rs, but Judge Bellwether pressed for statutory justification, which the lawyer struggled to provide convincingly. After considering the arguments, Judge Bellwether delivered his ruling. The court finds that the plaintiff has demonstrated a sufficient likelihood of immediate and irreparable harm should the defendant HOA continue its current course of action, particularly concerning the threats of property liens and non-judicial auction. He stated clearly. Furthermore, there appear to be significant questions regarding the defendant's legal authority for such extreme enforcement measures concerning parking on private property. Therefore, the request for a temporary restraining order is granted. He outlined the terms the HOA was barred from towing Catherine's vehicle, imposing further fines for the driveway parking issue, or taking any steps towards liens or auction related to this specific matter, pending further court proceedings. A wave of relief washed over Catherine. It was a crucial legal victory. Across the aisle, Evelyn Hayes's knuckles whitened as she gripped her purse. Her face remained a mask of composure, but her eyes, when they briefly met Catherine's, held a look of cold, undiluted fury. This restraining order granted was clearly not the end of the matter in her eyes. It was merely an obstacle to be overcome. The courtroom victory provided temporary legal relief, but back in Willow Creek Preserve, the atmosphere grew subtly tense. Neighbors who once offered polite waves now seemed hesitant, their glances lingering with unspoken curiosity. Within days, it became clear why. The news that Catherine Sterling was not just a new resident, but a sitting district court judge, spread through the community like wildfire. While no one could pinpoint the source, the timing strongly suggested. Evelyn Hayes, perhaps seeing an opportunity to reframe the conflict, had let the information slip, likely painting Catherine as someone attempting to leverage her position. The whispers soon solidified into something uglier. Anonymous flyers, crudely printed and left overnight on doorsteps throughout the neighborhood, appeared one morning. They didn't mention the parking dispute directly. Instead, they posed inflammatory questions. Is one resident using her powerful position to ignore community rules? And are judges above the same standards as everyone else? The smear campaign tactics were blatant, designed to undermine Catherine's credibility and isolate her within the very community she'd sought for peace. Finding one plastered to her own front door felt like a violation, a deliberate escalation from bureaucratic rigidity to personal attack. Shaken and disgusted, Catherine was taking her usual evening walk a few days later, trying to clear her head when she saw her neighbor, the older woman with the kind eyes from the HOA meeting, tending her rose bushes as Catherine passed. The woman looked up, glanced quickly around to ensure no one else was near, and beckoned her closer. "Judge Sterling," she murmured, keeping her voice low. "I'm Martha Jenkins. I saw those awful flyers. It's just shameful." She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Listen, dear, what the board is doing to you. It's not right, but it's not new either." Martha recounted her own HOA horror story from a few years prior, a protracted, stressful battle over the precise shade of beige she'd painted her garden shed, deemed out of compliance by Evelyn, resulting in fines and veiled threats, until Martha finally repainted it simply to end the harassment. "Evelyn doesn't like being challenged," Martha explained quietly. "She holds on to things. When she feels her authority is questioned, she finds ways to make life difficult. What happened with my shed was nothing compared to this, but the pattern, it's the same abuse of HOA power." Hearing Martha's story, Catherine felt a strange mix of validation and deepened concern. She wasn't alone in experiencing Evelyn's vindictiveness, but it also confirmed that this fight was intensely personal for the HOA president. Evelyn wasn't just enforcing rules, she was punishing perceived defiance. Thanking Martha for her quiet support, Catherine continued her walk. The path ahead suddenly feeling darker, the opponent more calculating. The flyers were one thing, cowardly and anonymous, but still just words. The next escalation crossed a line into something far more menacing. Catherine returned home late one evening after a particularly grueling day in court, pulling directly into her driveway out of habit and exhaustion before remembering the ongoing dispute. She sighed, grabbing her briefcase, planning to move the car into the now mostly organized garage after unwinding for a few minutes. As her headlights swept across the garage doors, however, they illuminated something that made her breath catch in her throat. Scrawled across the pristine white paint, in large crude letters of angry red spray paint, were two words: corrupt judge. The message hit her with physical force. This wasn't just an attack on her profession or her stance against the HOA. It felt deeply personal, a violation aimed directly at her, right on her own property. The anonymity of the flyers was gone, replaced by a bold act of property vandalism, a clear message of intimidation delivered under the cover of darkness. Suddenly, the quiet suburban street didn't feel safe. The feeling unsafe at home was a stark, unwelcome intrusion into the sanctuary she had sought. Who had done this? Someone emboldened by the flyers, someone acting on behalf of the HOA, perhaps even Evelyn Hayes herself. Though Catherine couldn't imagine the impeccably dressed president wielding a spray can. Her judicial composure momentarily fractured, replaced by a wave of anger, mixed with a chilling sense of vulnerability. They hadn't just defaced her property, they had trespassed, invaded her space, tried to instill fear. The HOA harassment had escalated from bureaucratic maneuvering to a tangible, potentially dangerous threat. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Catherine pulled out her phone and called the police non-emergency line. An officer arrived, took photos, listened patiently, and filed a report, though he offered little hope of finding the culprit without witnesses or evidence. The act, he noted, grimly fit the pattern of escalating disputes, but was hard to prove. The next morning, Catherine arranged for painters to cover the hateful graffiti. More importantly, she contacted a security company. Within days, discreet security cameras were installed around her property, monitoring the driveway, the garage, and the approaches to her home. This attack, meant to intimidate her into submission, had the opposite effect. The fear was real, but beneath it, Catherine's resolve hardened into steel. This was no longer just about fighting an unjust rule or defending property rights. This was about standing firm against malicious personal attacks and dangerous HOA intimidation tactics. They wanted her to back down. She would do the exact opposite. Several weeks passed after the vandalism incident. The ugly red paint was gone, replaced by a fresh coat, and the security cameras offered a small measure of comfort. The temporary restraining order seemed to be holding. There were no more official notices, no more flyers, Catherine adhering strictly to the spirit, if not the contested letter of the HOA rules. While the legal process unfolded diligently, parked her sedan inside her now organized garage every single night. A tense, watchful quiet settled over her corner of Willow Creek Preserve. The illusion of peace shattered one weekday morning. Running slightly late for court, Catherine hit the button on her garage door opener. As the door ascended, revealing the neat concrete floor, she stopped dead in her tracks. The space where her sedan should have been was empty. Completely empty. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't like before. This wasn't the driveway. This was inside her locked garage. She rushed inside, scanning the interior. The side access door was locked. The main garage door showed no signs of forced entry, no dents, no scratches around the lock mechanism. It was as if the car had simply dematerialized. This impossible car theft felt deeply disturbing, defying logical explanation. How could someone take a car from a locked garage without leaving a trace? As bewildered, panic began to set in. Her cell phone buzzed. It was David Chen, his voice tight with urgency. "Catherine, I just got a very strange, very cagey call from someone claiming to be an employee at Kowalski's Towing. He wouldn't give his name, sounded nervous, but said you might want to know. Your car is back on their lot, apparently processed for auction by the HOA. Back at Kowalski's, processed for auction. The TRO explicitly forbade towing or any action leading to sale. Disbelief warred with a cold, dawning horror. She drove her rarely used second vehicle, an older SUV kept in the other garage bay, straight to the familiar grim tow yard. This time, Gus Kowalski seemed different. The weary indifference was replaced by a distinct nervousness. He avoided eye contact, shuffling papers when Catherine demanded to know how her car, protected by a court order and secured in her locked garage, ended up back on his lot, destined for auction. "Look, Judge," Gus mumbled, wiping sweaty palms on his coveralls. Paperwork came through, saying it was authorized standard procedure for abandoned property on common grounds. Abandoned on common grounds. Catherine's voice was dangerously low. "It was in my locked private garage, Mr. Kowalski, and there's a court order preventing this exact action." Gus flinched. "I just handle the cars that come in," he stammered, clearly uncomfortable and unwilling to say more. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. No forced entry. Paperwork claiming abandonment on common property. This wasn't a sophisticated theft. It was something far more audacious. Someone almost certainly directed by Evelyn Hayes hadn't just violated the TRO. They had likely used fraudulent documents and potentially gained access to her garage through unknown means to commit a blatant illegal vehicle seizure. The stakes had just escalated from harassment to serious criminal activity. The drive back from Kowalski's was a blur of controlled fury and frantic strategizing for Catherine. She immediately called David Chen, relaying the impossible situation and Gus Kowalski's nervous deflection. "They didn't just violate the TRO. David," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "They manufactured a completely false scenario, abandoned on common ground. It was locked inside my house." David was already thinking several steps ahead. "First, we notify Judge Bellwether's clerk about the blatant contempt of court. Second, I need to get my hands on that tow authorization paperwork. Kowalski mentioned immediately, if it's what I think it is, this goes way beyond HOA overreach." While Catherine documented everything, the state of her garage, the lack of forced entry, the timeline, David worked the legal angles. He fired off a sharply worded demand to Kowalski's towing for immediate copies of all documentation related to the seizure of Judge Sterling's vehicle, citing potential litigation and the existing court order. The pressure clearly worked. Within hours, a scanned copy landed in David's inbox. They examined it together over a video call, the image stark on their screens. The authorization form looked official enough at first glance, citing vague local ordinances regarding abandoned vehicles. But two things immediately jumped out. The location listed for the vehicle recovery was Willow Creek Preserve Common Area, Oak Lane Cul-de-sac. A blatant falsehood, and the signature authorizing the tow positioned above Catherine Sterling's typed name was a clumsy, hesitant imitation. Definitively not her signature, forgery, plain and simple, David stated grimly, and perjury regarding the location. Whoever filed this knew exactly what they were doing. They created a paper trail to circumvent the TRO and justify seizing the car. This was evidence of HOA fraud, clear as day. Who signed off on Kowalski's end? Who accepted this? Catherine asked, scanning the lower sections. Looks like Kowalski himself stamped it, but the initiating paperwork, David zoomed in, filed by Willow Creek Preserve Management. No individual name, he paused. I need to lean on Kowalski again. He knows more than he's letting on. David called Gus directly. This time his tone wasn't accusatory, but firm, laying out the legal jeopardy involved in processing a vehicle based on forged documents, especially in violation of a court order. He mentioned obstruction of justice, accessory charges. Gus caught between the HOA's likely pressure and the very real threat of legal entanglement, finally cracked though cautiously. "Look, counselor," Gus stammered, his voice strained. "I didn't look too close at the signature, okay? But the lady who brought the paperwork in, real insistent, said it had to be processed immediately. No delays, dressed real sharp. Silver hair kinda reminded me of those news anchors. Silver hair, sharp suit, insistent." The description fit Evelyn Hayes perfectly. Before they could even fully process that confirmation, David received an urgent automated notification from a service that tracks vehicle auctions. Catherine's sedan, identified by its VIN, which Kowalski had clearly entered into the system, had been fast-tracked. It was scheduled for auction in less than 48 hours at a large clearinghouse in the next county. The ticking clock started. They had proof of forgery. A likely suspect in Evelyn, but the car was hours away from being sold, potentially making recovery vastly more complicated. "We need an emergency injunction. David now," Catherine urged, "and a contempt filing against the HOA. We have to stop that auction." The discovery of the forgery and the imminent auction deadline ignited a frenzy of activity, while Catherine compiled affidavits detailing the illegal seizure from her garage and the violation of the TRO. David Chen worked the phones with the court clerk, emphasizing the contempt of court and the criminal nature of the forgery. "We need an emergency injunction to halt the sale immediately." David stressed, his voice urgent but controlled. The vehicle was taken under fraudulent pretenses in direct violation of Judge Bellwether's order. Minutes felt like hours as they waited for the digital signature on the emergency order. Every tick of the clock echoed the approaching auction time. Less than 2 hours away now, and the auction house was in the next county. A good hour's drive, even without traffic. Finally, the email notification arrived. Injunction granted. Judge Bellwether had acted swiftly upon learning of the blatant disregard for his ruling. "Got it!" David exclaimed, already printing copies. "Let's move, Catherine. We have to get there before that gavel falls." They practically ran to Catherine's SUV, David navigating while Catherine held the crucial court order. The drive was a blur of tense silence, punctuated by David's muttered curses at slower traffic and Catherine's phone calls, one briefly updating the police detective handling her vandalism case about the forgery, and the illegal seizure forwarding the evidence David had compiled. The detective sounded startled, promising to escalate immediately. This was far beyond a simple neighborhood dispute now. This was felony forgery and potential grand theft auto territory. Cut to County Line Auto Auction House. The vast warehouse buzzed with activity. Dealers milled about inspecting vehicles under harsh fluorescent lights. On a raised platform, a fast-talking auctioneer rattled off bids for a pickup truck, the electronic board flashing numbers. Somewhere in the queue, listed simply as Lot 47B, sat Catherine's silver sedan, cleaned up, tagged, and ready for sale. The vehicle auction process was ruthlessly efficient. Cut back to the SUV. David glanced at the GPS, ETA 15 minutes, but the auction for Lot 40 just started according to their online feed. It's going to be incredibly tight. Catherine gripped the injunction papers, her knuckles white. The thought of her car being sold off due to a criminal conspiracy orchestrated by her HOA president was nauseating. Cut to Evelyn Hayes's immaculately clean kitchen. Evelyn poured herself a cup of tea, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly. She checked the auction website on her tablet, scrolling through the listings. She refreshed the page, her eyes fixed on Lot 47B. Her carefully constructed world depended on that car disappearing quickly and quietly into the anonymous churn of the used car market. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. Cut back to the SUV, they could see the auction house sign, now large and garish against the afternoon sky. David swerved into the parking lot, tires squealing slightly. "Go, go!" he urged, grabbing his briefcase. They sprinted towards the main entrance, the rhythmic chant of the auctioneer growing louder, mingling with the pounding in Catherine's ears. They burst through the doors just as the auctioneer announced, "All right, folks, next up, Lot 47B, a clean late-model sedan." This was the final moment in the desperate race against time. Lot 47B, a fine example, folks. "Who'll start the bidding at 5,000? The auctioneer's voice boomed through the cavernous auction house, echoing off the metal rafters. Hands started to rise in the crowd of dealers. "Stop!" Catherine's voice, clear and commanding. Despite her breathlessness from the run, cut through the din, heads turned, the auctioneer paused, gavel halfway raised, blinking in surprise at the interruption. David Chen strode forward, holding up the court order. "This vehicle, Lot 47B, is subject to an emergency injunction issued by the district court," he announced loudly, projecting his voice to reach the platform. "This sale cannot proceed. The vehicle was illegally seized and brought here under fraudulent circumstances." Confusion rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer lowered his gavel, looking bewildered. Auction house staff immediately converged, demanding an explanation. David calmly presented the signed injunction to the floor manager, explaining the situation. The TRO violation, the forged authorization documents. The manager's eyes widened as he read the court order, recognizing the gravity of the situation. He spoke urgently into his radio. The auction halt was immediate and decisive. "Apologies, folks. There appears to be a legal complication with Lot 47B, the auctioneer announced, visibly flustered. "We'll move on to the next item while management sorts this out." As the auction resumed with the next vehicle, the floor manager led Catherine and David to a side office. He was profusely apologetic. "We had no idea. Judge Sterling, Mr. Chen. The paperwork from Willow Creek Preserve Management looked legitimate standard procedure. We rely on the consignor's documentation. He readily agreed to cooperate fully and secure the vehicle pending further legal instructions. Catherine finally allowed herself a shaky breath of relief. They had stopped the sale. Her car was safe for now. Just as they were finalizing the arrangements, Catherine's phone rang. It was the police detective she had spoken to earlier. "Judge Sterling," he said, his voice serious. "Based on the evidence you provided and a statement we just obtained from Mr. Kowalski regarding the delivery of the forged documents, we have officers en route to speak with Mrs. Evelyn Hayes at her residence right now." Cut to Evelyn Hayes' perfectly manicured front lawn. 2 police cruisers pulled up quietly. 2 uniformed officers walked up the pristine pathway. Evelyn opened the door before they could even knock. Her face pale, the teacup rattling in its saucer as she set it down hastily. Her attempt at a welcoming smile looked brittle, forced. "Officers, is there a problem?" she asked, her voice a little too high-pitched. "Mrs. Evelyn Hayes," one officer asked formally, "we need to speak with you regarding allegations of forgery, fraud, and contempt of court related to the seizure of a vehicle belonging to Judge Catherine Sterling." He held up a copy of the forged tow authorization David had forwarded. Specifically this document. Evelyn stared at the paper, then at the impassive faces of the officers. The blood drained from her face. The years of carefully maintained control, the facade of untouchable authority within her small kingdom, it all shattered in that instant. There was no smooth explanation, no rulebook to hide behind, no deferential resident to intimidate. This was the law, real and uncompromising, standing on her doorstep. The antagonist exposed her reign of petty tyranny, reached its inevitable, ignominious end. Her shoulders slumped, the fight visibly draining out of her. The showdown wasn't loud or dramatic, but quiet and absolute. The weeks following the confrontation at the auction house brought a cascade of consequences that rippled through the once quiet Willow Creek Preserve. The HOA scandal became front-page news in the local paper, detailing the illegal towing, the forged documents, and the audacious contempt of court reporters camped outside the community gates seeking comments. Evelyn Hayes, facing potential felony charges for forgery and fraud, along with civil contempt proceedings, retained a high-priced criminal defense attorney. Her public appearances ceased. The impeccably dressed neighborhood matriarch vanished behind drawn curtains. The police investigation widened, interviewing other board members. While evidence suggested Evelyn was the primary driver, 2 other members facing potential complicity charges, or simply unwilling to weather the storm, tendered their resignations immediately. The HOA board resignations left the association reeling and rudderless. Empowered by the public exposure of the HOA's misconduct, other residents began sharing their own stories. Whispers turned into open discussion on the community's private social media groups. Several homeowners, emboldened by Catherine's successful stand and Martha Jenkins' quiet encouragement, consulted lawyers about past fines, liens, or unfair treatment they had endured under Evelyn's reign. The first civil lawsuits against the HOA began to be filed, seeking damages for years of alleged harassment and financial injury. Amidst the turmoil, Martha Jenkins stepped tentatively into the vacuum. She organized an informal community meeting, not in the sterile community center, but in her own welcoming backyard. Dozens of residents attended, a mix of anger, relief, and uncertainty swirling among them. They talked openly, sharing grievances and discussing the need for fundamental HOA reform. Martha, initially hesitant, found herself guiding the conversation, her quiet strength providing a calming influence. They spoke of transparency, accountability, and electing board members committed to fairness rather than autocratic control. Catherine Sterling watched these developments with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She cooperated fully with the ongoing police investigation and the court's contempt proceedings against Evelyn, providing clear factual testimony. The ordeal had taken a personal toll, the violation of her privacy, the stress, the sheer unpleasantness of it all. Yet seeing her neighbors finally find their voices, seeing Martha blossom into a community leader, brought a sense of profound, albeit weary, satisfaction. She hadn't sought this fight, but standing her ground had inadvertently cracked open the facade of enforced perfection, allowing for the possibility of genuine community healing and change. The impact of the legal battle extended far beyond her own driveway. 6 months later, autumn had returned to Willow Creek Preserve. but the atmosphere felt different. The oppressive tension that had once simmered beneath the surface was gone, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of openness. Following the scandal, a special election had installed a new HOA board, spearheaded by Martha Jenkins and composed of residents committed to transparent HOA governance. The CC&Rs were under review with town hall meetings, encouraging resident input rather than demanding silent compliance. Neighbors chatted more freely on evening walks, the fear of minor infractions seemingly lifted. Evelyn Hayes had accepted a plea deal, avoiding jail time but receiving hefty fines, probation, and a permanent ban from ever serving on any HOA board again. The civil suits against the old board were slowly working their way through the courts, but the message had been sent. The era of HOA tyranny in Willow Creek was definitively over. Catherine. Sterling sat on her back patio, a mug of cooling tea in her hands, watching the late afternoon sun filter through the oak leaves. The security cameras remained a quiet reminder of the ordeal, but the anxiety they once represented had faded. Her garage held only garden tools and seasonal storage. Now, her driveway, visible and clear, sat empty, simply because she preferred parking inside, not because a rule dictated it. The peace she felt wasn't the passive tranquility she had initially sought when moving here. It was something deeper, more resilient, a peace earned through unwelcome conflict, unexpected advocacy, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice prevail. She hadn't set out to change Willow Creek, but by refusing to yield to unreasonable authority, she had become an unlikely catalyst for its transformation. The community healing process was underway. A neighbor waved warmly as they walked by with their dog. No tight-lipped smiles, just genuine friendliness. Catherine waved back. This was the sanctuary she had hoped for. Not perfect, perhaps, but authentic. A quiet calm settled over her, deeper and more meaningful than she could have imagined months ago. Here, finally, was peace. Judge Sterling's unexpected battle in Willow Creek illuminates valuable life lessons applicable far beyond neighborhood disputes. Firstly, address small injustices proactively. Seemingly minor issues like Catherine's parking notice can escalate if ignored, eroding your peace and rights over time. Don't assume rules are inherently fair or justly applied. Question unreasonable authority, respectfully but firmly armed with knowledge of your rights. While seeking tranquility is a worthy goal, understand that true lasting peace often isn't passively found, but actively earned through resilience and facing challenges directly rather than avoiding conflict at all costs. Catherine's ordeal demonstrates that your principled stand can inspire others. Your courage might empower someone like Martha Jenkins to find their voice. Remember that allies often emerge when you act with integrity. Ultimately, defending your boundaries and values, even when uncomfortable, builds a stronger foundation for authentic peace and self-respect than simply hoping problems will disappear. Embrace challenges as opportunities to affirm your principles and potentially create positive change around you.